Mysteries, mindfuck, and magic. Welcome to the Otherworld. And who better to lead us into the Otherworld than Joshua Cutchin? Welcome back to our show.
Always a pleasure, gentlemen. I've been looking forward to this. Let's put it that way.
Hi. Joshua, a lot has happened since we talked last time. You've published more books than I thought was humanly possible. And you wrote your magnum opus, Ecology of Souls. I mean, this is just the first part, and that is the second. And this is the third part, and it's just footnotes.
Thank
I love it.
heavens there is a precedent for having a separate volume just dedicated to reference material, or I don't know what I would have done. I mean, I never intended to cut this up into two books. I always intended it to be one book, but as I started writing, it just became apparent that there was enough worth talking about that it facilitated the need to have it into two books. And just for sheer physical constrictions sake, there's just so much material to cover there. And I find that if you get a book that looks and feels like a brick, it's usually a turn off to folks. So yeah, but I I look back on this entire project and I'm not entirely sure how I did it. It was one of those things where everything came in very fast. Something It probably has partially to do with the fact that I've been thinking about it for several years, but it all came together quite quickly. And I feel like you can call it my magnum opus. I can't call it my magnum opus because that's pretentious. But it does feel like one of those things that you get finished with it. And it's like you say to yourself, I'm not sure if I'm ever going to write anything uh, quite like this again, both in terms of what it says and even more importantly in terms of length, because I never want to write anything this long again. But it really is a snapshot of my thinking as of 2022, 2023.
Mm, mm. I immensely enjoyed it. And it may be a unified field theory of the paranormal. So I imagine, I remember when we last talked, we ended our conversation with something like all the pieces are there, and we just have to put them together. Do you remember? We said
I
something along the lines of that, and I
I
think now you
do.
did it.
I do, and I'm critical of myself for agreeing to that statement, because I always have this hesitancy to think that you have it all sorted when you're dealing with this topic. And I feel a very irresistible pull towards that with this work, because it does make a lot of things fit together that I never really quite knew how to reconcile. A classic example that I always use is you talk to some witnesses about UFOs that become birds, and you can take the skeptical route and say, okay, well, this person's a crackpot. But when you talk to some folks, I mean, there's a story from my editor who is a good friend of mine who had more or less that exact same thing happen. What does that say about the phenomenon? How do you reconcile that? There's plenty of little things like that once you put it within this sort of framework of death, you can at least find a way of understanding it and making the pieces fit together a little bit better. Of course, the real sticking point in all this is that it's a new mythology of death and the paranormal, but I make no claims as to try to figure out what death itself is. So it's like a puzzle piece that, if this is what's going on, it's almost like a puzzle piece that we put together, not upside down, but facing the table. And so we've got all the pieces together, and now we can't quite flip it over to see what the picture truly is, but we know that this kind of fits together. That would be what I'd probably be more comfortable saying today. But it ended up sort of being a theory that I think stands on its own legs. And if I have a legacy that I would hope that this book would have, it would be to stand alongside other ideas like the extraterrestrial hypothesis, the ultra-terrestrial hypothesis, the cryptoterrestrial hypothesis. Let's throw the ecology of souls hypothesis in there as well. That would be my legacy if I could choose one. If that isn't asking too much and sounding too boastful or anything like that.
Hmm. So if you can't define what death is, maybe let's start with an easy question. What is a soul, Josh?
That's not much of an easier question. Because it's always so culture specific and culture dependent. I think that there's something of a hint in that old Greek term pneuma, meaning both breath and soul, and then you find the interesting parallels that can be drawn between a lot of these vowel-like sounds that are used for the divine, like Yahweh or Yao, or that sort of all om sound, or even the om sound that you use when meditating. Not to say that our souls are necessarily breath, but then you start spiraling out from that and looking at the production of DMT in the lungs, and it suggests that there's something about breath as an animating force that is somehow tied up in all this. But again, I'm still dancing around your question of what a soul is. So I suppose that if you have to land on an answer of what the soul is, at least for the purposes of the book, it would be an animating presence that, in my view, is almost fractal-like in the way that it expresses itself as a part of the whole. And my own personal sort of metaphysics surrounding this is that our consciousnesses and soul and consciousness have kind of become interchangeable. So I'm sympathetic to that as well. But each of our individual consciousnesses are like a wave on an ocean, and it's just a concrescence in time that comes up from the greater whole and sort of goes back into the greater whole, and parts of that wave might become part of another wave, but
the drop in the ocean.
Yeah, exactly. So that's sort of where I end up personally. And again, I don't know if that's really an answer, but that's sort of where I am.
Yeah. So for our viewers who haven't read Ecology of Souls, maybe let's describe a bit what you did there. So it started with a remark by Strieber.
Yes. So there were a couple of things that were playing out in my mind, and they all sort of ended up pointing towards this similar, I suppose it became a thesis, even though I didn't think it was a thesis at the time. Anne Strieber, wife of the world's most famous alien abductee, Whitley Strieber, was answering a lot of correspondence that the couple was receiving soon after the publication of Whitley's book Communion in 1987, I believe it was. And since writing this, I found out that Whitley was wanting to throw away all the correspondence because they were getting thousands of letters a day, more or less. And Anne was the one who said, no, we're going to read all this. And Anne sort of was looking at all the letters that they were receiving from other experiencers, because a lot of them were relieved that there was someone else who was being open about these contact experiences, and it sort of provided validation to them. And as she was doing so, Anne was keeping a list of running parallels and a running list of similarities that she saw between these encounters. And one of the observations that she made on a sheet of yellowed legal pad that we have here in the States is that this has something to do with what we call death, were her words. And Whitley has discussed those in a lot of his other books, but that's such an alluring quote, because what we call death. I love that sort of phrasing, but it also puts together two things that I think a lot of people in these separate communities, the parapsychology community and the ufology community, sort of want to keep separate. They want to keep these things very separate. UFOs are nuts and bolts physical spacecraft coming down here piloted by extraterrestrials. And the idea of mixing that into death or spirituality more general is really quite anathema to a lot of modern ufologists, especially we're recording this shortly after another whistleblower comes out and says that we have spaceships and bodies, and that's sort of the angle that you hear in popular culture and that you hear in a lot of these ufological circles. So the idea that this could somehow be tied in with something as intimate and personal as one's spirituality, as one's very soul, very being, is confronting, and it's confronting to the religious folks, and it's confronting to the You know, it's confronting. The religious folks take issue with it, the atheists take issue with it, the ufologists take issue with it. Not a lot of people are sympathetic to this idea. Luckily, I'm here with two folks who are. So that idea was always in my head. And then the other thing that always really intrigued me was a parallel that I thought went unremarked upon in some of the older ufological literature. One of the most formative books in my work is Jacques Vallée's 1969 book, Passport to Magonia. And in Passport to Magonia, Jacques Vallée does an excellent job, I believe, of pointing out that a lot of these UFO contact experiences seem to parallel older examples from folklore, especially, not exclusively, but especially some of these older Western European fairy stories. And if you do a little bit of digging, you can see that those fairy stories are not solely confined to Western Europe. They sort of appear everywhere with similar motifs, but just taking that angle. So the insinuation is that not that fairies are UFOs or that UFOs are fairies, but rather that these are two culture dependent ways of describing the same phenomenon. And that's all fine and good until you ask yourself what a 13th century version of Passport to Magonia would look like. And I would argue that it would say, well, you know, look at these fairies. They look a lot like the human dead. And this is not necessarily a controversial observation in and of itself. There are a lot of fairy scholars who have addressed the conflation between the human dead and the fae folk. And prior to the rise of theosophy in the late 19th century, this was something that was almost taken for granted among smaller communities in Europe. You know, there was some distinction between the two, but you would often have these stories, especially in Ireland and the British Isles, of dead people who were seen amongst the fairies, or you know, the fairies appearing at the time of someone's death, or there are illusions that people could become fairies after death, or different things like that. You know, my first book, A Trojan Feast, was all about this food taboo, and in so many of those stories where someone is warned not to eat or drink in fairyland, the person warning the protagonist is a deceased neighbor or a deceased family member who's there at the fairy party, right? So this is, again, not a controversial thing to say in fairy scholarship, but what is a bit, again, what makes the ufologist a bit uncomfortable is if you use the sort of the transitive property and you say, well, Vallée says that the UFO stuff looks like the fairy stuff and the fairy stuff looks like the human dead, then what does that say by that sort of transitive property about UFOs and the dead? And again, I'm not quite comfortable saying that aliens are the human dead or anything like that, but I am comfortable at this point, having done all this work that I have, saying that there is some sort of deep connection between these things and what you would call more or less soulcraft.
Yeah. Rudolf, you wanted to chime in? No. So in your first book, you covered a lot of ground about fairy lore, folkloric stuff, paranormal phenomena that UFO scholars normally dismiss or just tend to gloss over. And so it's
willfully ignore. Yeah.
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 You said it. So I mean, there's everything in there, isn't it? I mean, you have just near-death experiences, out-of-body experiences, psychopomps, shamanic traditions, entheogenic uses, death roads, fairies, mounts, the death roads, the wild hunt.
Well, that's why, I mean, that's why it became such a damn big project. I mean, you know, I wanted to keep the focus rather tight, and I kind of just wanted to write the UFO death book. But you soon discover as you're going through this that, well, in order to do justice to that particular topic, you have to address a lot of these older ways that we used to think of the human soul. And you have one of two options. You can either write more or less exclusively about UFOs and then constantly pause and discuss these older ideas and then return to what you're discussing, or you can just, you know, sort of set people up and say, here's the background that will sort of inform the UFO discussion and why there does seem to be a connection between death and UFOs. And that's kind of what the first book ended up becoming. But yeah, as soon as I pulled on this thread, I was quite frankly shocked to discover how many of these things always return to the human dead. Now, there's a case to be made that I've sort of got some blinders on, because death and the supernatural are kind of, if you go back far enough, they're one and the same themselves. So of course we would be associating a lot of these phenomena and a lot of these numinous states and strange locations with death. That seems to be natural, but at the same time, a lot of it's so specific. And once you bring that into the context of the sort of contact modalities that people have in these different experiences, then I think it does suggest that, yes, it all points to whatever that boundary is between us and the afterlife, which may well be us and the other world. So I think that if there's a real use in Ecology of Souls as in terms of bringing something new to the discussion, it's not necessarily pointing out the similarities between these things, and sort of saying, hey, this particular experience looks a lot like this particular experience. What it does, I think, is it puts all those experiences into dialogue with each other at the same time, right? So you had people like Eddie Bullard, one of the great unsung heroes of ufology, in my opinion. In his he wrote a book in the late 80s. I found a copy of it in my university library where I was working at the time. It's just two like giant spiral bound, just, it looks like it was printed out on a typewriter, two spiral bound books, UFOs Measure of a Mystery, which at that time was the most comprehensive compendium of alien abduction cases. And Eddie Bullard, in that work, as well as in subsequent work, has said, hey, look, this UFO stuff, these UFO encounters look a lot like what we would term broadly shamanic initiations throughout a lot of indigenous cultures. And then you had, in the 90s, Kenneth Ring was saying, hey, this UFO stuff looks a lot like these near-death experiences. And, obviously you had folks like Vallée saying that the UFO contact looks a lot like fairy contact, but no one said, okay, well, what if these are all describing more or less the same, if not the same experience, the same place, the same, do they have the same flavor? And I think a case can be made that it does form this sort of lattice work where any one experience bears a strong resemblance to the others, to a degree, right? Because it was interesting as I was making these comparisons, it would always be about a 75% match or so. Three-fourths of all the different data points that I would look at would line up, and then there would be two or three that would just be completely absent. Cryptids are a good example of that. I do think that some encounters with unexplained or undiscovered animals do share some overlap with these experiences, but it's not quite as good a fit as looking at things like the similarities between alien abductions, altered states of consciousness, near-death experiences, fairy encounters, and etc. So, but I do think that it does suggest that I think that we have a tendency to overcomplicate the issue of entity contact. And at one point in the book, I just say, contact is contact is contact. It's just, it all seems to be, I don't wish to become reductive, but at some point I think we have to acknowledge that there are a lot more similarities that these things have in common necessarily than differences.
I think it's important to acknowledge that you could easily mix up when you read your book or follow, not necessarily yours, but the whole topic. It's easy to what's the word, to mix those ideas up, like it's all the same and just using different words. But as you said, the important part is, I would say that it's roughly 75% similar or the same somehow, but every phenomena somehow has its own unique coloring or its own unique side. So there is, like you wrote, I'm as I as I mentioned in the pre-talk, I've so far only read the first one, but I've listened to your first interview with Barbara Fisher on 6 Degrees on John Keel, which was your the first podcast you did on Ecology of Souls. And there was Barbara wanted to like get the spoiler out of you talking about sea monsters, and I was like, yeah, give me the info, and I was really looking forward. And you said no spoilers, you have to read the book. And I was like, no, damn it! Now I have to read the whole first book just to get to the second one.
Well,
And I'm a really slow reader.
I can spoil sea monsters if you want me to. I remember very vividly that first interview with Barbara, because at that point, she and myself were the only two people who had read it, and we just sort of both sat down shell-shocked, and we're like, how do we even talk about this? Because it does end up being so expansive. Yeah, I think that the question is what accounts for that sort of missing, or that incongruous 25%. What is causing that? I have a suspicion that it's culture, but it very may well be that something is quantitatively or qualitatively different about a fairy encounter versus a near-death experience. Yes, they both have time compression or time dilation, but there's something actually at the bedrock of those experiences that is different. I'm very open to that. Do you want me to spoil sea monsters?
I'm not sure, but maybe yes. I don't have an issue with spoilers. I spoil myself all the time. So,
well, I guess that's something that a lot of folks might think that I sort of ended up cramming into the book because it doesn't fit. But I really highly disagree. Is the idea of putting cryptids into this, because cryptozoology has this very 19th century imperialist tag it and bag it and kill it and let's
belongs in a museum.
Yeah, exactly. It's let's believe indigenous testimony up to a certain point until they start talking about the magical aspects of these things, and then let's toss it out the window. That's sort of the MO of cryptozoology. And I suspect that as the years go on, cryptozoology is going to have a reckoning with their sort of more or less imperialist colonialist roots. But
let's hope so.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's stifling the discussion at this point, the fact that they're still approaching it from this very materialistic standpoint. But yeah, there is no shortage, as discussed by Timothy Renner and I in our book Where the Footprints End, of just strange Bigfoot encounters. And when Bigfoot encounters get strange, they tend to have some of the same things that you see in these other contact modalities. You do have missing time and disembodied voices and anomalous smells and apports and things like that. They do happen. So it made sense to sort of discuss cryptids in that capacity. And actually, the cryptozoology chapter is the largest chapter in both of the books. It's about 20,000 words long. Because there were so many different things that I wanted to discuss, and obviously discuss Bigfoot to a degree. Mothman is easy to bring into the death conversation because during the Point Pleasant flap, it was more or less a harbinger of death, and at least whether or not that actually was what it was, it has a reputation for that.
Yeah.
The lake monsters thing, I kind of approached it a little bit hesitant because I didn't know if there would be as much of a connection. In the back of my head, people have called Where the Footprints End, or my Bigfoot book with Tim Renner, they've sort of called it Passport to Magonia for Bigfoot. And again, while I don't think I'm fit to tie Jacques' shoes, I enjoy that description. So I sort of got a little bit pompous one day, and I was like, I'm gonna write a Passport to Magonia for lake monsters. And then I picked up a copy of Michel Merger's Lake Monster Traditions. Are either of you familiar with this book?
No, I've heard of it, but
it's Passport to Magonia for lake monsters is basically what it is. I cite it quite a bit in Ecology of Souls in that second volume because it's just the best thing that's been written on lake monsters through that sort of psychosocial lens. Unfortunately, it's out of print, so like some of if you're going to pick up a copy, you're going to be spending a couple of $100 on it. But I would love to see some smaller publishing company pick up the rights to do that, because I would hope that they would just make a ton of money on it, because it has so many ideas in there that need to be distributed. But anyway, I digress. So yeah, as far as folding lake monsters into this discussion of death, one of the things that I found myself really compelled to comment on was the significance of logs to lake monster lore. And what I mean by that is logs are important both to skeptics and mythicists alike. The skeptics often say that a lot of the lake monster sightings are nothing more than decaying logs that have gases that build up, and then the log shoots to the surface, and people say it's a lake monster. But interestingly, especially in North America, a lot of tribes would say that, oh, no, the lake monsters have the ability to appear as logs, have the ability to transform into logs. So logs sort of sit at a very important place in lake monster discussion, both in terms of belief and in terms of skepticism. The only place it's not really discussed is by cryptozoologists, right? They say it's either an animal or it doesn't exist. And the mythicists say it doesn't exist, and the skeptics say it doesn't exist, and the mythicists say, well, maybe it's kind of something in between. So yeah, logs are very important. And what is a log? A log is, if you use a little bit of transitive word association, a log is a death symbol. I mean, Jung talked about Totenbaum. And if you look at sort of what logs signify in the water, they were probably our first way to traverse water as a species. You know, you hop on a log and you just sort of paddle across. But inarguably, our first boats were little more than logs. You know, a dugout canoe where you burn the center and you scrape out the charred remains, and you create a dugout canoe that's basically a hollowed out log that you travel across. And that brings us into the discussion of what boats are. And boats are an incredibly powerful symbol of transition from, you know, arguably from the real world into the other world, but especially from the life into the afterlife. I mean, it's really quite a universal motif. From, you know, the Greek river Styx and the Greek river Styx and the ferry that crosses the Greek river Styx to islands Southeast Asia, to, you know, Polynesia, to, you know, the Norse ship burials, which even if they didn't always send people out to sea and shoot flaming arrows at their ships, they still, you know, had a lot of, people were interred with ships, and, you know, there were pharaohs who were interred with ships. So obviously it's the symbol of transportation across these vast distances. So in that sense, if a lake monster is a log, is a boat, then it's definitionally, to a certain degree, a death symbol. Now, the other thing that I found interesting was that is that if you take a look at Carl Jung's essay on flying saucers, he makes an argument for the UFO as soul, which is an entire separate discussion that we can have later if you'd like to. But one of the reasons that he suggests that is the fact that the UFO in its classic disc shape is a mandala. It's a symbol of wholeness. It's a symbol of totality, right? You don't get that with lake monsters, but you do get something that's close enough that it makes you ask if the similarity is significant. To sort of elaborate on what I mean, you know, you've got these classic depictions of the dragons with the tails that spiral, right? And in Michel Merger's book, he actually points out that sort of looping dragon tail might well be an artistic representation of some of these lake monster sightings, where you get the hump, you get the half circle, which again, if the UFO as a circle is a symbol of totality, then what does the half circle of the lake monster's humps become? It becomes, in my opinion, a symbol of brokenness. And that ties very much into a lot of what the dragon is as a symbol in the West. You know, the dragon is more or less a cancer around the roots of the world tree. You know, it gnaws away at existence. You know, you've got devouring dragons in Ragnarok, and in Revelation, you've got all these ideas of the dragon being this negative symbol. And I think it's really interesting to contrast that against some Egyptian mythologies. You know, you've got Ammit, the soul devourer, who is this demoness who's got the head of a crocodile and the mane of a lion and the body of a hippopotamus. Any one of those body parts you could apply to a lake monster sighting. You know, you've got these water horses that have these long flowing manes. Some lake monsters have this crocodilian snout, and obviously the humps that you see in the water look quite hippopotamus like. And then of course there's a case to be made that Ammit and Corazon, the entity with which Uncle Al was so obsessed with, Aleister Crowley, have a certain degree of similarities as well. And Aleister Crowley had Boleskine House on the shores of Loch Ness. So again, where does this leave us in terms of what lake monsters are? I'm not sure, but a case can be made that there is something, if not benevolent, then reconciliatory and beneficial about the UFO. I don't get that on a symbolic level from the lake monster, if that makes any sense. There seems to be something genuinely sinister going on there. So I've often said in interviews, since Ecology of Souls came out, I've said that I never thought I'd be as terrified of lake monsters as I am now. but in a way, like all of the symbolism really does point to that infernal sort of dragon concept. And sure enough, I believe it's Donald Ormond was the gentleman who tried to exorcise Loch Ness in the 70s, I think. And he was on the hunt for lake monsters in various parts of the world, and he went on a guided tour through a strait in Scandinavia with a guide, and they saw lake monster, or water monster humps approaching them. Ormond was quite frightened, and the guide who was captaining the boat, he said, "Oh, don't worry about them. They never harm me physically. They only harm men's souls." It's like, okay, well, this is starting to form quite a consistent picture here, and sort of a grim and spooky picture. So that's more or less the long and short of the lake monster question. That, and the fact that I think that much as with Bigfoot, there's a lot of high strangeness that occurs in conjunction with lake monster sightings that, as with high strangeness in Bigfoot encounters, often goes under or unreported.
Yeah. Is there also, as I said, I haven't read the second books yet. Is there also a connection between the log from the changeling aspects and Twin Peaks and
Log
stuff?
lady. Mm-hmm.
Well, I hadn't considered that, but now that you mentioned that, I'm kicking myself for not including that. I mean, yeah, because there's,
okay.
In case anyone's wondering, there was changelings in fairy folklore were substitutions for human children, and the substitution that the fairies made was typically one of three things: a sickly fairy infant, an elderly fairy, or, as alluded to, a log that was cloaked with glamour to appear animate. So I do wonder if there's something in regards to that's worth unpacking that I just completely didn't think about.
Maybe it's too obvious in a way, like just mixing up stuff, but that's the first thing I thought about when you mentioned logs.
Yeah. No, I mean, that seems. I mean, I suspect that might be a similar sort of motif that's at work there, because what invariably happens to these changelings is that they end up dying. So yeah, that seems to be another expression of the log as a death symbol. Yeah, that's a great point.
In this moment, I'm just thinking of Pinocchio.
yeah.
He came from a log, and he is in this liminal state of not being a real boy, not being alive, but
and animated by a fairy.
The same motif, isn't it?
Well, and I haven't read the actual novel of Pinocchio, so I can't speak to that. Is there as much of a fixation on death in that as there is in the Guillermo del Toro adaptation?
Yeah.
There is. Okay. So I mean, yeah,
it's of course it's very questionable from a modern standpoint. Concerning,
sure, yeah.
You don't have to. You mustn't do this. You mustn't do that. And then, but it's always obsessed with them. Of course, the being devoured by the whale. That's so old as a mythology. So.
Yeah, no, that's a motif unto itself, being devoured by the dragon or the belly of the whale.
Yes. There's this new adaptation by Guillermo del Toro, Pinocchio, and there Geppetto mourns the loss of his son Carlo, like Carlo Collodi, who wrote the book, and because he wants to replace his dead son, he manages to
a facsimile.
It's a facsimile of a dead person, Pinocchio.
I mean, so that's part of what I've found so alluring about the whole Ecology of Souls thing that I produced is that when I start to hold that in the back of my mind, I see it manifesting throughout so many places that I didn't think I would. And, you know, rather than my typical impulse to want to catalog everything, I'm just left with this feeling of, oh, of course that looks like that, because that might be very well what these things are getting at. So yeah, I do see this in popular culture all the time. I see it expressed in aspects of mythology and folklore that I never once thought I would. And when you see it in pop culture, not specifically the Pinocchio novel, but just in pop culture in general, it kind of makes me wonder if we don't realize this connection on some deeper archetypal level, and we're just expressing it. Like, we have a sense that there's something soul involved with UFOs, and we can never quite put our finger on it, you know. And then the contactees tried to sort of start religions around it, and they brought up reincarnation all the time. And you know, the modern ufology wants to sort of strip that out, even though a lot of the cases still bring in discussions of souls and telepathy and such. But like, I think that we realize it on an instinctual level that there's something there, you know. I think there's some sort of connection that we often make, even if we don't consciously realize that we're making it.
For me, it's also interesting because we both come mainly from the magic side of things, from occultism, whatever you want to call it, or ritual magic. So when you look into different traditions, the medieval grimoire magic, etc., and the fairy traditions and so on, in a lot of magic traditions, the overlap between UFOs and entities and, I don't know, evocations and stuff is so obvious that it's, for me, sometimes hard to not to understand why people don't see it. I mean, I think it was in Dimensions by Jacques Vallée, where he was talking about people like famous mathematicians who also did ritual magic, where they summoned all kinds of spirits, and then airships came and they called them the sylphs or the spirits of the air or whatever he called them, and they traveled to the ritual place in a ship or in a flying castle, and they popped out of nowhere. And the whole overlap with the jinn, where that's basically the same stuff. And for me, I just started in a specific form of ritual magic in medieval grimoire magic, roughly, not quite a year ago, in the elucidation of necromancy, the lucidarium, and where it's a version of the Heptameron where you do a specific timings in magic. And it's targeting especially the spirits of the air that are somehow the jinn kings in a way, and all kinds of separate things. And the manifestations you get from that can be personally, I have had some physical manifestations doing the rituals, but not in a UFO kind of thing,
right?
But a lot of people I know that work with that system had exactly that happen, and we also had stuff like that happen in different kind of ceremonies where you summon something and it just a ball of light pops up in the sky, and you would say it's a UFO, and then it's manifests somewhere else and does something different. So it's so hard to not see that.
I've got a quote from your book, Josh, that really summarizes what Rudolf just said, and I wanted to read it, and then maybe you can elaborate a bit.
Okay.
So it's just 2 or 3 sentences. A tantalizing question arises. If we visit their realm in NDEs, psychedelic trips, shamanic initiations, and alien abductions, what is happening when they appear in our world? Are fairy, alien, and spirit shamans ingesting entheogens in the other world? Are they having brushes with death on the other side and suddenly popping up bewildered in the alien environment that is Earth? Our perception of this reality as normal may amount to simple conditioning. To an alien intelligence, our world may look as foreign as any psychedelic landscape.
Yeah, so I have so many thoughts. Well, what Rudolph was saying was it reminds me of something, a conclusion that I reached several years ago. I remember in college thinking to myself, being around some of my friends, I was like, man, I get really tired of those atheists, but damn if they're not the smartest people in the room everywhere I go. And now, so about a decade passed, and nowadays I say to myself, damn, those occultists, they're always the smartest people in the room.
Or the
Because
most stupid ones.
well, okay, yeah. If you can get an occultist who hasn't, gone up his own ass, right?
Yeah.
If you can get an occultist who actually has kept a level head about themselves, present company included, there you go. Then they're some of the most knowledgeable people on all this stuff, and they've made a lot of these connections. And you present these connections to them, and they go, "Yeah." they say, "Of course, it's it's all connections. There are these connections to make." That's been my experience with my closest occultist friends. So yeah, that all that stuff about the spirits of the air. I mean, yeah, these things want to give you things. They have this desire to give you things if you ask the right way, and it always comes with a price. But you do see that across, the sylphs and across the jinn and the fairies, and especially in classical necromancy with the dead. You do see these sort of things coming time again, both gifts, material and immaterial. But to the quote specifically, yeah, this is an idea that I find really interesting, and I don't know. I like it more as a thought experiment as opposed to that's exactly what's happening. Just sort of playing with this idea some I think is fun, because if you've even read a little bit of your literature about UFO occupants, or about even some of these cryptids or gnomes or things, the number of times that the eyewitness says that they were startled, not the eyewitness was startled, but the entity was startled or surprised to have been seen. The assumption has been that these things seem surprised that they can be seen by human beings, but I kind of wonder at the same time if they're not just as startled at seeing a human being, and they're just as we are as foreign to them as they are to us. And I do like the idea of a bunch of Bigfoot in some dimension in their sophomore dorm room taking mushrooms, and slipping into this reality. I love that idea.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if that should be applied literally, but it does speak to this idea that I heard Terence McKenna speak of, and obviously Terence McKenna is a huge influence, yes, on Ecology of Souls. The name Ecology of Souls was a phrase that he used that I thought really summed up the diversity of sort of these entities that we're dealing with. But he spoke in a lecture one time, and I don't really know which one it was or what the exact quote was offhand, but he said something to the effect of, then if we could actually manage to spend hours or days or years in this other psychedelic realm, it might become just as navigable as our own, or something like that. And I do think that there's something worth exploring in that, because it also suggests how, what I like about a statement like that is that it does sort of re-enchant the world. Like, I'm looking out my window right now and seeing the fractal nature of the trees and how much detail there is that we just sort of end up filtering out. The same sort of detail that we're usually awestruck by when we talk about psychedelic visions. And it kind of says, well, this reality itself is psychedelic. It's just the psychedelic reality that we're embedded in. And I don't necessarily think that UFO occupants are consuming entheogens or having brushes with death, but it's a question that begs to be asked. And I think it takes on a little bit more weight when you look at some of these allusions to the other realm, whether or not it's the other world or the afterlife, being sort of, there being a revolving door between that world and our world. What I mean specifically by that is that There's some spots in the fairy folklore where there's this direct allusion that being dead in our realm means being alive in the fairy realm, or vice versa. I mean, there are allusions to fairies that laugh at funerals and cry at births, because there's this idea of this balance between being between these two areas. And if that is the case, that, you know, it's not, it's this, there's this interplay between these two worlds, as opposed to like what we think of as this linear destination. You know, I'm in this reality, I'm born, I live this reality, and then I die and I go to the afterlife. If there is sort of a cyclical aspect to it, or an exchange between these realms, then the idea of being able to cross over into this reality from another reality, I think, is probably a possibility, you know, just in terms of whatever techniques, maybe similar techniques in that realm as there are here. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. For me, I'm still trying to figure out how to formulate, because it's not really a question, but it's still a loose thought. But are you familiar with the concept of perspectivism in anthropology? It's something I think Gordon White mentioned it. No, not I think. I'm quite sure. Gordon White mentioned it a few times. How Forests Think by Eduardo Cohn is an amazing book where he dives into American Ecuadorian shamanism, so quote unquote. And there's also Eduardo Vivero de Castro, who was writing a profound paper called Cosmological Deixis and Amerindian Perspectivism, and where it's a completely new view on life, on all those different planes, on shape-shifting, on consuming food to turn into something else, from being a human to becoming a jaguar as a symbol of a spirit world. Like it's amazing read, and it would fit right into your valley.
I just made myself a note to look it up, because this sounds familiar, but I'm not sure I've delved into it as deeply as I should. I mean, I guess that's something that I am very sympathetic to, is this idea, again, of exchange, not the idea of either side of any of these realities possessing something or being permanent, but there's this idea of a flow and an exchange between these two existences, or multiple existences, as it might be. I think that's probably, I have my own personal suspicions that that's probably a pretty accurate read on the way it goes. Perspectivism and How Forests Think?
How Forests Think by Eduardo Cohn. It's a bit, he's a linguist, so the first roughly 100 pages are a tough read, and they're important, but it's a bit like, yeah, fuck. But
read a paragraph, put it down, think, read a paragraph.
But afterwards, he goes more into practical, and in his time he spent with the people there, and I completely lost the name. Runa? Is it called the Runa?
The Runa, yeah.
Yeah, and the paper by Vivero de Castro. I can send it to you afterwards.
Please
it's a relatively short paper, but it's very dense and it's not every page setting it down and thinking about it, but every second sentence or something.
Right.
So,
I mean, please do, because I mean, this is the sort of thing. Again, this is probably why I have gravitated more towards the occultists than I do the UFO nerds, right? Because I think that these are perspectives, and these other different ways of thinking are just as useful with all these other topics as they are to, you know, philosophy, or ethnography, or occultism. I think that they should be applied to all these different things, and it's not reaching out into the ufological population as much as I think it should. So please do send that my way. That's something I'll be very interested in.
Yeah, I think you'll love it. So if you could put the Ecology of Souls hypothesis in 2 or 3 sentences, how would you describe your point?
Well, see, that's something else that I realized about writing this book, is that when you try to say it straightforward without doing, you know, hundreds of thousands of words of backing up your claims. You kind of sound like a kook.
Yes.
Right. I mean,
Welcome to the club.
Yeah, right. Well, yeah, it's one of those things where like I have to get people to buy into the possibility that UFOs and or UFO occupants might be psychopomps, which is a weird idea, and we should probably define psychopomp at this point. But it's a weird idea that it's like when you just come right at someone with that, they're like, wait, what? But once you sort of pull this apart, you can kind of illustrate that. So I guess I'll take a step back and do that first. So there were three things that influenced the writing of Ecology of Souls. One was the Anne Strieber quote, one was Passport to Magonia and sort of thinking about the implications of that. But another one was George P. Hansen's The Trickster and the Paranormal, which is, again, one of those foundational texts that I keep on returning to. You know, Patrick Harpur's Demonic Reality is another one of them. But Trickster and the Paranormal, I think, is an excellent book. And it's really solidified in paranormal pop culture or paranormal research culture, this idea of the trickster archetype being an embodied aspect of these phenomena. People misinterpret it and they think that there's a capital T trickster like deity or entity, and that's not what it means. But still, the idea of the trickster should be pretty familiar to folks who are involved in the supernatural. And Hansen does a great job of pointing out how a lot of the behavior that these archetypal tricksters would engage in is the same kind of behavior that we have come to expect from the paranormal and the supernatural. But again, it's that one thing, like as in Passport to Magonia, there's another step that you can take a little bit further. And when you take a look at the fact that some of these tricksters also serve the duty of psychopomp, then it sort of puts this within, again, that death framework as well. The classical and classic example of being Hermes, the Greek god of escorting souls across the divide. In addition to other duties he fulfilled, like being the god of contracts and the god of boundaries. But again, contracts and boundaries, we're talking about death again. So psychopomps are these figures that it's one of those words that a lot of, at least in America, people say that they don't know what psychopomp means. And I'm like, you know what it means, you just don't know the word for it. These characters that escort human beings from our world into the afterlife. So, you know, in one of the most popular folk psychopomps is the Grim Reaper, you know, which I believe is German in origin, I think.
Really?
But I believe so. It's a pretty late invention too. I think it's like an 18th century like fiction book that mentions the Grim Reaper with his scythe. But even before that, we had other folk figures. We also had deities like Hermes, like Anubis in Egyptian mythology. A lot of indigenous cosmologies had their own. Barnum Beer was one among certain Aboriginal tribes. Odin was one to the Norse. Valkyries obviously were one to the Norse as well. Psychopomps oftentimes pulled double or triple or quadruple duty. They often had multiple duties. So just because Odin is Allfather doesn't mean that he can't also be a psychopomp. You know, in the Abrahamic traditions, you might have Jesus and the angels serving that role. Or natural phenomena like the sun and the moon and the aurora borealis, or even natural animals like birds and deer and dogs. And anybody who's wondering why I mentioned UFOs and birds in the beginning might remember that now. That kind of makes a little bit more sense, I suppose. In the case of, you know, natural phenomena, these are things that might embody death and rebirth, like the sun and the moon do this death rebirth cycle. For animals, there are oftentimes animals that embody themes of navigation or traveling vast distances, you know, birds and horses, or loyalty, dogs. So that's what a psychopomp is. And when you look at sort of the suite of characteristics that psychopomps have, they're oftentimes similar qualities to what tricksters might have, to the extent that, you know, in some cultures, you know, shamans might serve that psychopomp role to their tribe, and might actually employ sort of tricksterish deception in the spirit realm to get a spirit to actually make that transition. If somebody's wanting to stay here, they might be able to trick them or entice them to move on to the afterlife. And you can draw some deep connections, and you can draw some superficial connections. One connection that I find really fascinating is that a lot of these psychopomps have wands or staves. Hermes has his, I'm not going to try to pronounce the Greek word, but his stave with the snakes entwining it. Odin, sometimes in his capacity as a ferryman, might have an oar. Obviously, Charon, who escorts souls over the river Styx in Greek mythology, has an oar. The Japanese psychopomp Jizo has a staff or stave, rather. And this sort of idea of a wand or a staff expresses itself oftentimes as a means of making that transition into the other world, into the afterlife. The number of times that you can see in popular culture someone knocking on something with a staff 3 times and then something opens up, it's the idea. In fact, the golden bough actually takes its name from a golden bough that's used to open up the other world. But guess what else has wands? Fairies and aliens. And the wands in fairy folklore go back far before they became little women with wings. Like, this is an old motif, and in contemporary stories we have wands and alien abductions all the time. So that's just one example of the comparisons that you can draw between UFO occupants and these psychopomp figures. So once you do all that backstory, you kind of get this picture that perhaps UFO occupants are psychopomps, and perhaps they do have something to do with the migration of souls back and forth. You can gather a lot of offhand comments from alien abductions that the experiencers report, the entities saying, that do seem to imply that they are at the very least preoccupied with our souls, if not tasked with directly ensuring the transmission or the flow of souls from some other realm into our realm. Then you have all these stories about reincarnation in alien abductions, people learning about their past lives or learning that they were once an alien, quote unquote. You have these stories of pre-birth memories. People claim to remember some sort of contract they signed before they were born, agreeing to abduction. So there seems to be something involved with souls and soul stewardship in the UFO experience. And I'm just realizing the irony now that you said in a couple of sentences, tell us what Ecology of Souls is, and I've just gone off on a 10-minute digression. So the idea is that a majority of paranormal phenomena are tied to death, and that the UFO phenomenon specifically is part of a mechanism to ensure spiritual development and the reincarnation and cycle of souls between the living and the dead. I think is probably the most succinct way to put it. Within that statement, there's a lot of room for, well, it might be this and it might be that, or maybe it's not this at all, but that's probably the most succinct way that I could put it. I do suspect that there's a clue to all this in the way that the Greys have the proportions of a human fetus, and that there does seem to be this reproductive obsession that these phenomena always seem to have. And the reproduction obsession, and not just the UFO stuff, but everything from incubi and succubi to Bigfoot and fairies. I suspect that reproduction obsession is really a manifestation of the death obsession being its complete inverse. But again, as Barbara Fisher, my editor, said, she's like, Josh, she said after all was said and done, and we titled it and everything, she's like, Josh, the book's not really about death, right? I said, yes, I know. She said it's about the cycle of life and death. It's about the constant reincarnation and rebirth. And it does seem to be like these things are here to teach us lessons and or see us coming into or out of this existence. And what lies on the other side of that, anybody's guess. There were certain things that I decided to not try to redefine because the book was going to be big enough. So I didn't try to explain what death was or ghosts were or what the afterlife was like. Those are discussions, I suppose, for another day.
Yeah. Thanks to Barbara Fisher for helping you.
Yes. No, yeah, no. Barbara is a great, Barbara was a great help with this, and we're continuing to maintain a close relationship with a lot of my upcoming projects too. So she's a part of the team now.
Yeah, also a very great podcast. Highly recommend. Yes. 6 Degrees of John Keel. amazing
Yes.
podcast.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Just
Absolutely.
wanted to mention it.
Mm-hmm.
So to slowly wrap things up, what I so love about your work is that it doesn't follow the trap of either or thinking, but puts things on a spectrum. Like what's important to our show as well, that it's not this world and or the other world. So we are embedded in the other world.
Right.
So, and it's an ecosystem. And
right. And you'll meet people who they try to find a scientific way to say what you just said. And that's all that you need to say is what you just said. Like, we're embedded in both worlds, but they'll say things like, humans are transdimensional beings. And I kind of just have to rub my face and shake my head. Not that I don't admire people trying to quantify this with science. I think that there's a place for that. But at the same time, we used to have such an elegant, simple language for this. And now we're talking about things like transdimensional beings. And at the end of the day, we might even decide that there is another world and it can be quantified as a dimension. But I think it's getting farther away from something that we already know, if that makes any sense. I think
this just has the limits of scientific thinking and language.
Yep.
Nothing against science, but the limits of and the history. If you look at the history of science and the limits it has put on itself and what it includes, what it doesn't include, like we all know that, but it's another deep dive you could go just to see all the issues and the traps that are there, and then we have to somehow make up words like multidimensional, whatever. Like, what does it even mean? Yeah, and then you have to have different in physics. Yes, they have different definitions of dimensions, and it's used differently in common language and in how it's used in pop culture, and it's and another dimension isn't necessarily another world. It's just a mathematical abstract concept and stuff like that. So we're throwing words around in science and pop culture and the ufology, and it's just doesn't mean anything.
Yeah, maybe we can discover that we already have the language. It's the language of the imagination. There are myths and legends and
metaphors.
Metaphors. They are. I think they are better.
I do too.
For describing these things.
I really do. I mean, I think that the scientific method is a great tool for describing things that happen in whatever this is that we're in.
Yeah.
But once you go beyond that, I don't know how useful they are without falling into. I mean, even when people want to say things like dimensions, they're still employing a metaphor, because a lot of people think of dimensions as a place that you go. And if you read something like Flatland, that's not what it's talking about. Like, you literally can't conceive of what that other dimension is. If you're a two-dimensional stick figure, you see a circle when someone puts their finger down. You don't see the finger or the hand or anything else. It's not a place that you can go. So yeah, I can't tell you how strongly I sympathize with what you said. I think that the most powerful and elegant and clearest language that we can use to describe this stuff probably is metaphor, and probably has already been used. And so I sort of suggest that maybe a return to that we can sort of bolster with scientific jargon might be the right way to go.
And it's hard to see, like, when you have scientific models, how they try to fit stuff into it that doesn't really fit into their model in the first place, and in all the assumptions and stuff. But when you're a scientist, that's how it works. That's how you have to do it. That's the limit of science. Right. And so
and we know that there's going to come a point where we have to rebuild a lot of fundamental assumptions, because that's just what tends to happen. And our current model, this sort of physicalist paradigm that we're all in, is our best guess right now. But I would not be surprised if in the next 100 years there's a massive shakeup and we have to sort of reevaluate a lot of these things that we take for granted. It's just our way of interfacing with this existence. Yeah.
So after you put this monster of a work out into the world, which I really heartily recommend to our viewers, you wrote a novel.
Like an idiot, like a fool, I wrote a novel. So yeah, it's Ecology of Souls came out in July, so we're coming up on a year here next month. I also about 2 months ago released a compilation of essays on fairies and film that I have some contributors that help me out with. Although that was actually finished before I even started research for Ecology of Souls. It just sort of sat on the shelf for that long. But I also, in the past couple of months, decided to write a novel. And I had kind of been playing with an idea. I've kind of gotten frustrated with a lot of the films and books that I read. Not necessarily in terms of, oh, that's not faithful to folklore, or oh, that's wrong, or that's not the way the phenomena works, or anything, but just simple things like stories that don't quite know how to end right. I feel like we've seen so many movie franchises and television series that have had finales, and they just are not satisfying in any sort of way. So that was sort of a motivation to do it. Part of it is that it just came to me, and another part of it is something. Is that what I wrote about was something I kind of have wanted to see for a while. But the other thing is that I wanted to experience the more than human in a way. And what I mean by that is that I've spoken with enough friends who have written fiction who had told me things like, once you have your characters in place, if they're actually decent characters, they will start telling you what to do.
Yes.
They'll have that. And like a good little Jungian, I would say things like, oh, people don't have ideas have people. But I'd never experienced that firsthand. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
So I said, okay, well, let's experience this firsthand, and I'll be damned if I didn't. There were things that would just come to me, and they would sort of tie up things and solve problems in thematically resonant ways that was quite striking, and it did not feel like it was coming from me. Interestingly enough, I read an article about an interview with Ray Bradbury a while back, and he said that he experienced the same thing. Sometimes in the small hours of the morning, he would go down to his library and just pluck one of his books off his shelf and read it, and just sit there in awe, like looking at the pages saying, I have no idea where this came from. So that possibility was really quite alluring to me. So I wanted to do that. And also, after you write something like Ecology of Souls, the last thing you want to do is use more endnotes and footnotes and references, and you want to be completely freed from all those constraints. And also, like, what do you write after you write that? You know what I mean? Do you so I just wanted to try something completely different. I did finish it back in May, and it's currently with a couple of beta readers, and Barbara Fisher is doing some editing on that. And I should have I should start some revisions in July. I don't think they'll be substantial enough that I can't finish them by the end of July. So probably late summer, early fall for a release for that. So I'm again, I could sell one copy and I'd just be happy that I did it for me, because I wasn't sure that I could write a novel, and it's just I'm enamored with some aspects of it, and it's just, if there's one copy and it sits on my shelf, that's fine by me. I did it for me. So
it's a very different kind of writing.
It is. It's simultaneously more difficult and easier. It's easier in the fact that you don't have to. You aren't constrained, and you don't have to search for connections, and you don't have to do all the sort of fastidious referencing that I prefer to do in my nonfiction. But it's definitely harder, because sometimes you're just staring at a little blinking cursor on the screen and it's like, where is this? Sometimes the ideas have you, and sometimes you have the ideas, I have to say. And sometimes you just are looking at that and you're like, I don't know exactly where this is going to go. But if you sort of tease it out, it tends to manifest on the page. So it was very different. I really did enjoy it, but there's some aspects of it that let me put it this way: I'm ready to look at nonfiction again. I'm ready to look at writing nonfiction again after doing this, take a little bit of a break from the fiction route. So we'll see. I think it is going to be released. For a time there, I was wondering if it was just going to live in a desk drawer for the rest of my life. It was just going to be just live down there, and no one has to read it until I die, and then they'll read it and make fun of it. But actually, it does look like I will be publishing that sometime in the next couple of months. So I'm really excited to see what people think. The idea was to write something that was faithful to folklore, but also had some ideas going on underneath it. I didn't want to write something that's just like monster porn or like UFO porn, like, oh, it's just like, oh, big UFO and it's creepy. Like, I wanted to write something that actually had that was saying something about the human condition and about, it had some themes going on. So yeah, I'm excited for that. Hopefully some other people are too. We'll see.
I'm very much looking forward to it.
Well, thank you. I appreciate it. And then after that, I'm on to another project with Barbara. We're co-authoring a book as well. So we'll see how that goes. It's a big project.
Tell us what it's going to be about. It's I
don't know if I've mentioned this to anybody on a podcast. So I guess I can go ahead and say it because no one else would be foolish enough to tackle this topic. It's going to be sort of a comprehensive look at anomalous light phenomena. And a lot of the theories that are out there regarding what it could be. Just so part of it's going to be just compiling a lot of those theories and making arguments for or against them. And part of it's going to be bringing some new unpublished anomalous light stories onto the page, which hopefully some of the ones that we've picked are quite unique in some of the aspects that, it's not just the usual story of I saw a light in the sky. But yeah, so it's an exciting idea because I think an argument can be made that it's the most common aspect across all these different modalities. Like lights are everywhere and they're in everything, including the cryptozoological stuff, the cryptid stuff. The cryptozoologists don't want to admit that anomalous lights have a place in cryptozoology, but they do. So that in that respect, I think that it's something that's worth pursuing because anything that's common might hold some secrets that might shed some light on what's going on. On the other hand, it's a bit like drinking through a water hose. Like you're just there's so much information. And my tendency with topics like this is to be comprehensive. And this is something that you literally could not be comprehensive on because it's in more or less every paranormal book that's ever been written is something about strange lights. So we're going to do our best. Hoping it's just one book and not 2 or 3 or 5, but
you have a bad history with that.
I know. I remember writing Ecology of Souls and sort of getting to the first UFO chapter and saying to myself, okay, I can get in and out of UFOs. I can do a chapter on UFOs that's 20,000 words long. I can get in and out of UFOs that quick. And of course, the entire second book almost is just the UFO stuff. But if I put out a book that was called A New Mythology of Anything and it was 50,000 words, you might go, oh, it's really? So I guess longer is better in that case, but I have made a vow to never write anything that long ever again. So
yeah, I think we haven't had a show since the beginning that covered so many topics we're interested in. I mean,
we didn't even get to half the stuff is the funny part.
Exactly.
I have a special passion for the mountains and monuments chapter, the ancient monuments chapter. I've never gotten to really write about monuments and like I think that's, I mean, as you well know, we've discussed some of this in the past. I think that's an absolute crucial part of a lot of the stuff that doesn't get placed within this context as often as it should. So that's another aspect of it. And oh man, there's just so much.
Yeah. I loved your proposition that these ancient monuments, the menhirs and so on, are like outposts of the other world.
Yeah, they're missionary chapels.
Yeah.
in our existence. Yeah. And speaking of which, I'm taking off tomorrow to visit Cahokia here in the U.S. the Cahokia Mounds, which is been a bucket list for me. So
I envy you.
I will
Don't
say
get
hello.
yourself abducted.
What was that?
Don't get yourself abducted.
Well, I hope
Well, or do, and then come
yeah,
back.
exactly. We'll see.
That's what I wanted to ask. Maybe there's another version or an analogy of you in the other world who has written a book about
the humans.
about the humans and how they do some thing called magic, and it takes
right
psychedelics and so on. And would be interesting if you two meet. And
yeah, so I've got the beard. I guess he'll have a mustache then. My evil twin. Yeah.
Great, Josh. It's been a pleasure as always.
Yeah.
Well, gentlemen, it's so much fun to talk to y'all. We could probably go for another 3 hours if we wanted to, but you always bring a smile to my face, which I appreciate.
Thanks.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, y'all.
So, if people would like to contact you, we put your page in the show notes, of course, but just maybe say it out loud for people just listening.
Absolutely. Joshua Cutchin, JOSHUACUTCHIN.com. I was distracted, so I think I spelled my name right. JOSHUACUTCHIN.com is your spot to find everything and to get in touch with me. I do offer full sets of Ecology of Souls at a discount. If you buy 2 or you buy all 3, I offer a discount. I probably should restrict those sales to the States, simply for post purchases. Obviously. I don't think you're going to save any money by buying from me and having me email outside the States. But if you're in the United States, we can do that, and you'll save a little bit of money and get them signed by me. So just let me know. Otherwise, you can find the books on Amazon, for better or worse.
And they're linked in the show notes as well.
Thanks so much, y'all.
Wonderful. So,
that was so much fun. Yes. I hope I didn't ramble too much. I told you just set me going, and I'll just go.
That's why we wanted to have you.
Well, I appreciate it, and I appreciate all the kind words. I don't want. Part of me does feel like anything I write after this is just going to be, it's going to come second place. It does feel like it feels like a life's work kind of thing. So or this is the end of the show, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
I've already stopped recording.
Okay. Okay.
Just thank you, and see you soon again. The world is magical.
Yeah.